This is The World Tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News, reporting from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
The space business is never going to be free of risk. We can't make it perfect, and this country doesn't print enough money to let us do that, and that's not what we're trying to do.
NASA's Richard Truly and the nation on the edge of our seats as the hour for blast-off of Shuttle Discovery draws ever nearer.
There's a lot of steps, a lot of checkouts, a lot of criteria that's got to be met between now and T0 tomorrow morning. But the vehicles look good, people and teams look good, and even the weather is looking good to me right now.
Indeed, the fickle Florida weather is even drawing admiring glances from meteorologist Captain Tom Strange.
Overall, I have a big smile on my face because I think the weather's going to turn out to be pretty darn good.
The impending launch has captured enormous interest. Not even for the Apollo moon flights have so many spectators and journalists jammed the Cape Canaveral area. It's a wondrous prospect for Chamber of Commerce official Joe Catrambone.
It will be wall-to-wall people. It has a carnival atmosphere. It's fun and it's exciting. It's great. We've been waiting for 2 years now for this to occur.
Discovery's mission is essentially the same as Challenger's: deploy a $100 million NASA communications satellite. But it is, of course, more than that, a moment to put fear behind, to get back up on the horse. The 5 seasoned spacemen who'll fly the mission know the risks, and CBS News consulting astronaut Jeff Hoffman says they'll meet the challenge.
They have basically done all the training that they can possibly do, and they've brought themselves up to a peak. And it's a very peculiar time. It's almost like the quiet before the storm. What you've really got to do is to maintain your readiness, but you can't sit around and chew your nails.
Now, we all wait out the last long hours, and tomorrow we'll all be aboard as Discovery rockets away. I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. More of The World Tonight with Doug Poling in New York in a minute.
CBS News, I'm Vicki Kelly. T-minus 10 hours on the countdown clock at Florida's Kennedy Space Center. Right now, NASA officials say prospects for an on-time launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery are looking good. Workers are spending the night getting ready. They'll begin loading up the external fuel tank in a couple of hours. The 5-man crew was put to bed early for an early morning wake-up call. The astronauts' families are waiting behind the scenes. Among them, Kathy Covey, wife of astronaut Richard Covey.
When I hold my breath, after it goes off, I won't be alone. I think there'll be a lot of people holding their breath for a few minutes there.
The widow of Challenger astronaut Michael Smith says she will be.
After all, aren't we flying with the crew of Discovery this launch? I will be.
Former shuttle astronaut Bob Crippen will make the final decision whether to launch or not. He says everything will be done by the book.
Conditions look good for shuttle launch and more American gold in Seoul. With Mutual News, I'm Fred Lowry in Washington. America's space shuttle program set to resume in just under 9 hours with the scheduled launch of the Shuttle Discovery at Cape Canaveral. Mutual's Jay Barbary reports NASA has begun the final countdown.
The main job for the launch team in this final countdown is to pump more than 500,000 gallons of fuel into the Shuttle Discovery's huge external fuel tank. This is to begin around 2 a.m. Eastern Time, but before fueling begins, officials will take a hard look at the weather. At the moment, it promises to be favorable.
The United States regained a measure of basketball respectability Thursday at the Summer Olympics in Seoul. America's women's basketball team won the gold medal by defeating Yugoslavia 77-70.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Because of an ill wind, NASA has closed the Space Shuttle's launch window by about 1/3. Periodically during the final hours of the countdown, NASA sends up weather balloons to check winds in the upper atmosphere. And right now, spokesman Ken Senstad says those winds are too light, could throw off guidance computers, which are programmed to steer the shuttle in stronger breezes.
If we launched with the winds aloft being as low as they are, our trajectory could be affected. So what we're going to do is extend the current hold for 1 hour. The launch cannot occur before 10:59 a.m. The launch window closes at 1:50. So we're sending more balloons. We will send additional balloons up to check these winds. Hopefully they'll increase. If not, we won't be able to launch today.
Preparations for launch had been going very smoothly. The shuttle's external fuel tanks were filled in the early morning hours, and there have only been what are described as very minor technical problems. But spokesman George Diller says the 5 astronauts were told to take their time over breakfast because of the extended hold.
The crew will wait an hour to go on board. The reason is that the flight suits that they're using now are somewhat uncomfortable, and there's no reason to put them in those and put them on board any earlier than we have to. So if we can see something that we'd like to solve before we put them into the flight suits, then we'd rather let them have an extra cup of coffee before we suit them up.
So the count stands at T-minus 3 hours and holding for an extra 60 minutes. The earliest launch time 1 minute before 11 Eastern. It could be Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev for the Nobel Peace Prize. They're considered among the top contenders for the award, which is expected to be announced in about 2 hours.
This morning's launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery will be America's first since Krista McAuliffe, a New Hampshire schoolteacher, and her 6 crewmates died on the Challenger on the 28th of January, 1986. Before that tragedy, we had got to the point in the American space program where people were going up for rides. We had such confidence in the technology that we did not glorify astronauts especially anymore the way we had honored John Glenn, say, or Neil Armstrong. The Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions, the walks on the moon, already seemed ancient history by then. By 1986, we were ready to send pretty much anybody up. A congressman had ridden the shuttle into space, Senator Jake Garn, remember? And in Washington, there had been talk about journalists, Walter Cronkite maybe, or poets. How about a handicapped person, somebody suggested. It was all symbolic. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger was a cross-section of America. There were men and women. There were white, black, Asian, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. That may have been coincidence. Everyone was certainly qualified. But it was more likely done as a conscious effort to demonstrate something about America, who we are, and how we can all work together. There was a beauty in that, but somehow it made the tragedy, when it came, all the worse. When the explosion came, it ended 7 lives and ended the symbol phase of the space program as well. In this launch of Discovery, things are different. The shuttle crew consists of 5 white men. As Henry Allen wrote in the Washington Post the other day, an astronomer and 4 military guys with mustaches. He quoted John Lodgson, the director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, as saying, "We cannot make long-term exploration of space a series of media stunts. If they lose this mission, they've lost the company. We're back to running a test mission," he said. "So we have test pilots." The Osgood File. I'm Charles Osgood, CBS News.
Shuttle Discovery launch chances judged marginal because of wind conditions. American women win more gold as Olympic officials clear U.S. stars of drug rumors. Soviet leaders rush to Moscow for SNAP Central Committee meeting. Good morning, Bill Lynch with the CBS World News Roundup. This was the day the nation's space program has long awaited, the nation's first manned flight scheduled for today since the Challenger disaster 32 months ago. The 5-man crew has started being driven to the launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center an hour late for work. That's because NASA's hyper-cautious managers didn't like the wind conditions for a 9:59 Eastern Time launch and added an hour to the built-in hold. They now say that chances for a launch today are marginal. Christopher Glenn is at the Cape. Chris, it's a beautiful morning down there, and it's an unusual case of the winds being too benign.
Well, that is the condition aloft, up in the upper atmosphere. The situation is that the spacecraft computers are configured and programmed long before launch to expect winds this time of year within a certain velocity at that altitude, and if they're not within range there, the computers don't have adequate data to steer the craft through those weak winds properly at the higher altitudes. There's also some concern about the winds here on the surface, which may in fact be the opposite problem, too strong. They have a restraint on conditions which say you can't have more than a 12-knot crosswind across the landing strip that they would use should they have to return to the Cape in the case of any emergency. And they're currently 10 knots, and they're expected to build as the morning wears on.
There's another 5 hours left in this launch window today with marginal chances for a liftoff today. Do you think they're going to let the crew stay in the cabin all that time?
Yeah, they dawdled over breakfast, and they had a little extra time there because when they get into the spacecraft while they're on the pad, they're sitting down, lying on their backs, and it's quite uncomfortable, so they don't want to keep them in that configuration too long. As you mentioned earlier, they're in the Astrovan, and they're being driven out to the spacecraft now, and they will get into the spacecraft and into position, but they do have an extra hour on the launch window for today, so if all goes well, we could have some extra time to get this launch in.
But just to clarify, everything is fine with the shuttle itself, with the booster rockets, no problem with the equipment.
Yeah, the bird is clean, the day is beautiful, and it's only those tricky winds that are keeping things up in the air, so to speak.
Christopher Glenn, thank you. Tens of thousands of people have jammed the viewing sites near the Cape, and we asked some why they came.
Because it's once-in-a-lifetime chance.
I will see the Discovery go up for the Challenger. I'm hoping it'll go up and everything will be all right.
And we'll keep you posted on launch conditions for Shuttle Discovery. The time now, 3 minutes past the hour.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center. The clock keeps ticking. The countdown for the launch of Space Shuttle Discovery is at T-minus 1 hour 39 minutes. With several built-in holds, that puts the liftoff at 10:59 Eastern Time, an hour later than planned because of fickle winds in the upper atmosphere. Astronaut Richard Truly, NASA's Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, says the shuttle's guidance computers aren't programmed for winds as light as they are right now.
This is an example of the kind of thing that I was hoping to make people aware that could very well happen, and it might be a different situation in an hour or a different situation tomorrow, but we do know what we're doing. We do know what our criteria are for liftoff, and we're going to get there.
It's better to wait for a change in the weather than a change in the computer. That could take more than a week. While we wait, preparations for launch continue. The 5 astronauts are getting aboard the shuttle with their newly designed pressure suits. One problem has cropped up there. NASA says the fan that moves air through co-pilot Dick Covey's suit isn't working, so technicians are working on it. The United Nations peacekeeping forces have won this year's Nobel Peace Prize.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chet Douglas with the latest from ABC News. They've awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to the United Nations Peacekeeping Force. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But first, there's only an hour to go for the launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery. If there are no more problems. NASA's already run into a couple this morning, one of them with a fan in a spacesuit. ABC's Bettina Gregory at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida fills us in.
NASA has just defused, or should I say refused, the situation. They have just fixed the fan on the seat of pilot Dick Covey. That's the fan that's hooked into his spacesuit to pump cool air through it. But the weather is still the major problem. It's absolutely gorgeous here on the ground, but those upper-level winds are still from the wrong direction. If they don't change, and the Air Force weather people say that's not likely, NASA will not launch today.
If the weather problem persists, NASA officials say they'll try again tomorrow.
High right now as it's ever going to get. We'll never reach that peak that we were at in January of '86, I don't think, but we're right there, nibbling at it, and everybody's excited and with great anticipation of this launch, and we need to go do it.
I'll have more for you after this.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center. NASA's big digital clock stands at T-minus 9 minutes and holding. Hugh Harris, the voice of Shuttle Launch Control, says a launch attempt planned for just a minute ago has been put off for about half an hour.
The crew has been advised about the aboard weather area, the weather in the aboard areas, and are in the process of going through the tasks that are necessary to get us to a launch this morning.
The weather here at Cape Canaveral appears to be less of a concern now. The latest data from weather balloons indicates that winds in the upper atmosphere have shifted in the shuttle's favor. But the job of sealing the cabin and checking for leaks was delayed when the cooling fan in co-pilot Dick Covey's pressure suit refused to work. Technicians had to hunt down a new fuse. Former astronaut Jeff Hoffman says use of the suits has been resumed as an added safety measure.
If you are exposed to ambient pressures above about 50,000 feet, your blood will boil, and the only way to survive a situation like that is to wear a pressure suit, and it's to give them that extra measure of protection that they are now wearing pressure suits.
Another former astronaut, John Glenn, is here at the Cape to witness what is hoped to be a launch. He's anxious to get America back in space.
The basic research that we're missing by not being up there. That's the reason we have a program like this. It's not just to expand the human spirit by letting people travel in new areas. It's basic, fundamental research.
Glenn says experiments aboard this shuttle could benefit AIDS and cancer research. I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Now with more news, here's Mike Pulsifer.
We'll be carrying live coverage of the launch starting in just one moment.
Return to space, the flight of discovery. I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The final minutes now, just some 8 minutes or so before the long awaited Discovery mission, 977 days after that terrible moment that Challenger exploded. But since that day, so many changes in the shuttle system. 46 major design changes, 400 lesser ones, and 210 fixes to the orbiter alone at a total redesign cost of $1.2 billion. NASA thinks it has a safe vehicle and it will have a safe flight today. The crew, 5 veteran astronauts, all of them male. The commander is Frederick Houck. He's a Navy captain. The pilot, Richard Covey. 3 mission specialists, John Lounge, who's called Mike, David Hilmers, and George Pinky Nelson. And between them, if my addition is correct, they've flown a total of 9 shuttle missions. Listening to the air-to-ground chatter after they entered the spacecraft this morning, you have never met a cooler bunch of pros. There have been some delays this morning. This flight should have been off the pad an hour and a half ago, but weather balloons sent up to monitor wind conditions aloft earlier sent back some peculiar data. Those winds were blowing more slowly than expected. Now, the spacecraft computers, which do the flying during the launch phase, are programmed to take those winds into account, and thus an hour delay was ordered in hopes conditions would improve. They did. And the only other problem that developed was solved easily. The crew is wearing new pressure suits for the launch and landing on this flight, and they are hot. So fans are built into their seats to force cool air inside. 2 of them weren't working when the crew clambered aboard, but it was a case of blown fuses, and they were easily replaced. Primary objective of this mission, to deploy a satellite almost identical to the one that was lost in the Challenger disaster. It's called TDRS, for Tracking and Data Relay Satellite. It's a $100 million piece of hardware to become part of a network that NASA will use to keep track of orbiting spacecraft, eventually replacing a series of costly ground stations that are scattered all around the world. And if all goes well, it will be deployed from Discovery's cargo bay about 6 hours or so into the flight, and then later on boosted to its final orbit high above the Earth, many thousands of miles, where it will assume what they call a geostationary position. It will appear not to move with relation to the ground. Coming up now on just past 6 minutes left in the countdown.
5 minutes, 54 seconds and counting.
There are, of course, a tremendous number of people who have come to watch this flight. They are strung out on the causeways and the roads lining the water here at the Cape, eager to see what is going to be a spectacular sight, as always, when the shuttle finally lifts off, just about 5.5 minutes from now. We talked to some of them earlier today.
Very excited. Looking forward to it. Seen 3 previous flights, and this is going to be one to remember.
All the way from Raleigh, North Carolina. Went and got a car, started driving down here, waiting for the gate to open up and get in there.
Came in from Orlando. You got a 17-year-old grandson sleeping in the back of the car, and grandma's sleeping here on the ground. So we're enjoying it. We got a good one going this time.
It is a good one indeed. Everybody seems to be having a good time, but of course there is that nagging apprehension, those leftover residual fears, knowing what happened to Challenger so long ago. John Glenn, the first American in orbit, was by some time ago, and we asked him what the importance of this flight is in the history of the manned spaceflight program.
Anytime there's a first in space, it comes down as a notable flight. For instance, Al Shepard's suborbital flight, my orbital flight, the first flight around the moon, the first landing on the moon, the first shuttle flight, all those are flights that were more notable. I think this is sort of a restarting of a program after a difficulty, but it should have a lot of attention because the success of this will go a long ways in determining how rapidly we get back into doing the research and go ahead with the space station. And I want to see us move on to that space station just as fast as we can. That's the next step.
Former astronaut and, of course, Senator John Glenn speaking with us a little bit earlier today. Things are happening thick and fast now as the final events of the countdown take place. We're going to listen to a little bit to the launch narrator for NASA, Hugh Harris.
The main engine final purge sequence is underway. The orbiter flight control surfaces, such as elevons, speed brakes, and rudders, are now being moved through a
A lot of technical data there from Hugh Harris describing what's happening right now in the countdown. If something should go wrong, there are many options that the crew has. The shuttle has 4 abort modes. They can abort once around the Earth. They can abort up to orbit if they need to, and then figure out what to do. They have landing sites across the Atlantic, so they can do a transatlantic abort landing, or they can even turn around and glide back to the launch site if they're close enough when they have an emergency situation. The primary landing site for a once around the Earth abort is out at Edwards Air Force Base, where the eventual landing 4 days from now will take place. And standing by out there today for us is KNX, our sister station KNX reporter Tom Hewell. Tom Hewell, how are things going out there? What's the atmosphere?
The atmosphere out here, Chris, is one of apprehension, as you say. These delays have caused some apprehension, but it's also one of hope. Ground crews are sitting around at this point, their attention virtually glued to the monitors, which show the shuttle on the launch pad there at the Kennedy Space Center. As you say, if something should go wrong, the shuttle can do a single orbit of the Earth and return here to Edwards Air Force Base. NASA spokesman Ralph Jackson says all the landing supports equipment is standing by in convoy form on the Rogers Dry Lake bed.
The convoy's been practicing.
Tom Hewell,
they've run several full-up sims
this morning, where the landing will be 4 days from now. And we are looking at a countdown clock that has a little bit more than 2 minutes remaining on it. Let's see if Hugh Harris of NASA has any more information for us.
T-minus 2 minutes and counting. Liquid hydrogen replenish of the external tank has stopped, and pressurization to flight level is underway. The vehicle is now isolated from all ground propellant and fluid loading equipment.
Roger, that's complete.
And as we look out toward the launch pad, Shuttle Discovery is poised, the Florida sky blue, a bank of clouds some distance offshore, providing a backdrop for this tableau.
T-minus 90 seconds and counting. Less than 2 minutes away from the launch of STS-26 and its crew of 5. And we have heard that the clock will hold at 31 seconds.
Looks like we're going to have a hold at 31 seconds into the count, as you heard Hugh Harris just say.
The clock will hold at T-minus 31 seconds due to a failure. We have not heard what that is yet.
It's going down.
Some kind of a problem, unspecified as yet.
CO2 going in from the suits. Okay, and with your concurrence, we'll clear the air and proceed.
T-minus 50 seconds and counting. We're going to clear the air and proceed. And a concurrence from the launch director to proceed.
And if we clear, we will not stop at 31. Is that true? That's correct, MTD.
We will not stop the clock. The orbiter computers have positioned the vent doors, T-minus 31 seconds.
They're not going to stop.
We have a goal for auto-sequence start. Discovery's 4 redundant computers have assumed T-minus 23 seconds and counting. The SRB nozzle profile, T-minus 15. 14, 13, 12, 11, 10. We'll go for main engine start. 7, 6. Start. 3, 2, 1, 0. And liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
There they go.
Crew confirms roll program.
Godspeed.
Controlling.
Bright orange flame, a familiar sight to this reporter, but one filled with apprehension nevertheless. Climbing straight up into the sky, beginning their roll program now. They'll go into orbit on their backs, heads down. That's the configuration. We hear the roar of the rockets reaching us at the press site now. The building we're in starting to shake. Climbing straight up into the clear Florida sky. No clouds in its way. Off they go. 40 seconds into the launch now.
65% now.
Climbing straight up. What a sight. Through a small piece of cloud.
Again, the throttle back up at about 59 seconds.
High enough for us to lose sight of them because of the restrictions of the window through which we're watching.
Mark 1 minute. Velocity 2,300 feet per second. Altitude 5.9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Coming up now on that fateful point in the flight of Challenger where the explosion occurred. There's the call, go at throttle up.
Discovery given a go at throttle up. 3 engines at 104%.
They're
Velocity
now
3,200 feet per second. Altitude 10.8 nautical miles. Downrange distance 8 nautical miles.
They're now experiencing the maximum dynamic pressure that they will feel at any point in their flight, the period of the most stress.
25 seconds from solid rocket booster separation.
Waiting for solid rocket booster separation, a very critical point in the flight.
4%. Velocity 4,800 feet per second. Altitude 20 nautical miles. Downrange distance 19 nautical miles. Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Here it comes. Let everything go right.
Solid rocket boosters have separated.
All right. There they go.
2 minutes, 20 seconds. 3 engines still running 104%.
The millions of gallons of fuel in the giant external fuel tank feeding the spacecraft's 3 main engines at this point. The solid rocket boosters have been blasted away from the side of the shuttle assembly successfully, and the rocket is heading downrange. The external tank will be empty of its fuel and jettisoned about 8.5 minutes into the flight. We're coming up on 3 minutes into the launch right now. A CBS affiliate radio station here on the Florida Space Coast is WMEL in Melbourne, Florida, and we have in our studio with us today Cliff Lethbridge. And Cliff, you have covered every single one of these events. Is it fun for you?
Oh, it's always fun. This time was probably the least fun of all with all the restless apprehension that I've had up to this point. But this definitely, if this mission goes like it looks like it's going to, this is definitely one of the better days of my life.
It looked good to me, and I must admit that I had a lot of butterflies, and my hands were shaking a little bit. How about you?
Oh, definitely. For about 3 days now, I've been like that. So this is no exception.
You've been working close to the Cape, lo these many months of redesign and changes. What kind of an attitude has NASA adopted now, considering the Challenger disaster? Have they changed in their approach to this whole operation?
Their attitude does seem to be still rather conservative. It's a get-it-done philosophy, and get it done so that the shuttle works properly and safely. So there would not have been a rush today to get the shuttle off the ground. For example, if the weather had not improved in time, there would have been no rush. So there's a reserved optimism at this point, and certainly this mission, if successful, is going to help a great deal.
Negative return.
Negative return to call.
Discovery now can no longer turn around and return to the launch site in the event of an abort. 4 minutes, 20 seconds. Velocity 8,700 feet per second. Altitude 59 nautical miles. Downrange distance 148 nautical miles.
Essentially, the work of the launch teams here at the Cape is over. The control of the spacecraft passed over to the Johnson Space Center in Houston 7 seconds after the launch. As soon as the bird cleared the tower, the electronics control switched over there automatically. So Houston calling the shots now.
Press to ATO. Select Banjul.
Press to ATO.
All this indicates Discovery could reach an abort to orbit on 2 engines if that were to become necessary.
They could still get into orbit even if one of their 3 main engines fails at this point.
Altitude 65.7 nautical miles, downrange distance 203 nautical miles.
5 minutes, 15 seconds into the flight now.
Standing by for a press to MECO call.
MECO, which you will hear more about as this flight continues, is main engine cutoff. That happens about 8.5 minutes into the flight, or just about 3 minutes from now. Press to MECO will be the call, meaning let's go for it.
Discovery, press to MECO. Group Banjul 109.
Roger.
Crew given their press to main engine cutoff call, indicating they can proceed to normal main engine cutoff on 2 engines if that were to become necessary.
Discovery, performance nominal.
Nominal performance. All systems looking good from the viewpoint of the ground.
6 minutes, 10 seconds. Velocity 13,900 feet per second. Altitude 68 nautical miles. Downrange distance 323 nautical miles.
Discovery, single engine Banjul 104.
Some communications parameters being sent up there.
Indicates Discovery could achieve a single engine landing at Banjul if that were to become necessary.
That's one of the transatlantic landing sites.
Transatlantic abort sites.
That would only happen if they had loss of 2 main engines about now or any time from now to the end of the powered phase of the flight. Ben Guerir is in Morocco.
6 minutes, 50 seconds. Velocity 16,400 feet per second. Altitude 66 nautical miles. Downrange distance 405 nautical miles.
They have another landing site in Morón, Spain, and Banjul, as you heard them say, is a location in the nation of Gambia. Well, all that's left of the site of Discovery sitting on the pad now is the leftover smoke.
Cutoff is expected at 8:33.
Discovery, single engine press 104.
Roger.
Discovery's crew told that they can press on the main engine cutoff in the event of a 2-engine failure. 3 engines running at 104%. 3 good APUs, 3 good fuel cells, velocity 20,000 feet per second, altitude 61 nautical miles, downrange distance 527 nautical miles.
All of that very good news.
The throttle now to maintain 3 Gs.
So we're waiting for just another 35 seconds or so, and we will have the main engine cutoff. At that point, the spacecraft is...
Mark 8 minutes, velocity 22,500 feet per second, altitude 59 nautical miles, downrange distance 619 nautical miles.
The spacecraft will be without thrust and essentially just coasting the rest of the way to orbit. A little later on in the flight, they will do some burns of what they call the orbital maneuvering system, some engines which will tweak their orbit into its final and proper form.
Main engine cutoff. Velocity 24,600 feet per second.
Usually they're...
We will continue live coverage of the Space Shuttle Discovery.
3 main engines.
For all intents and purposes.
Discovery, nominal MECO, ohms 1 not required.
Normal main engine cutoff has occurred now.
Okay, thank you, Houston.
Crew informed that ohms 1 is not required. There'll be an ohms 2 to round out the orbit at the expected altitude. Standing by for external tank separation.
Discovery, your go for APU shutdown on time.
Roger.
APUs provide hydraulic power to operate the aerodynamic services and to gimbal the engines.
We are eavesdropping on mission control and the Space Shuttle Discovery. And coverage will continue here on KLBJ AM. I want to tell you, coming up...
Booster Systems engineer reports that the excess propellants remaining in the lines are being dumped out through the main engines as scheduled at this time.
I want to remind you, coming up in the next hour, we're going to be talking about cooking for hectic families. We will have periodic updates from Mission Control via CBS on the Space Shuttle Discovery as they become available to us. The time is 10:48 on KLBJ AM as coverage continues.
So now we sit about 11 and a half, coming up on 12 minutes into the flight of Discovery, this long-awaited day. Everything at this point, according to Mission Control, going perfectly, nominally.
Discovery Houston, we're
proceeding. They are proceeding down the flight path exactly as scheduled, and they're following the flight plan precisely, with no apparent problems, no indication of any troubles from either NASA or the crew.
One manifold, two manifold open, that probably caused it. We got them all closed in.
Bit of an echo there in communication with the spacecraft.
That exchange with the ground crew talking about an oxygen pressure difference beyond what was expected. The crew noticed an open manifold and has closed that, and they expect that solves the problem.
Minor problem which the crew solved by hand, apparently.
Space Shuttle Discovery still on its way to orbit after a successful ascent up through main engine cutoff. We still will be requiring an OMS 2 burn, and that will circularize the orbit at approximately 160 nautical miles. That burn occurs at about 30 minutes into the flight. We're now communicating with the crew of Discovery through the tracking data relay satellite.
So there you have it from Mission Audio. Everything going well. A successful launch. They are in orbit. Everything is looking good. No problems at all to speak of. And this is Christopher Glenn at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This has been Return to Space, the flight of Discovery.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center.
10, we'll go for main engine start. 7, 6, start. 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
America is back in space with a bang. 32 months after the Challenger tragedy and after a few minor snags that delayed the countdown nearly 2 hours this morning, Space Shuttle Discovery made a picture-perfect liftoff into the blue sky over Cape Canaveral. 2 minutes and 4 seconds later, the redesigned solid rocket boosters cut out and dropped away right on schedule.
Solid rocket boosters have separated. 2 minutes, 20 seconds. 3 engines still running 104%.
The boosters' parachutes opened and they drifted slowly down to the Atlantic Ocean where they'll be picked up for reuse. Then, nearly 9 minutes into the flight, Discovery was in orbit.
Main engine cutoff confirmed. Discovery's 3 main engines have now shut down as programmed.
If all continues to go well, the 5 shuttle astronauts will spend 4 days in space. Their first and most important task comes about 6 hours from now when they deploy the TDRS communications satellite in Discovery's cargo bay. I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center. Now with more news, here's Bill Lynch.
Much different reaction in the nation's classrooms. Norfolk, Virginia elementary school teacher Ron Fortunato.
It was just perfect. The launch went up, and I can remember clearly 2 years ago we were sitting here watching it, and I saw clearly today what the future of our space program is, and maybe just as important, what the future of education is for these kids.
And from these first graders at the Radburn School in Fair Lawn, New Jersey.
It's been exciting. They were all watching, and it was very exciting to see.
President Reagan, addressing a group at the White House a short time ago, congratulated the crew, wished them all the best on the remainder of their 4-day mission. Nearly 10,000 United Nations peacekeeping soldiers from 30 countries will share the 1988 Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee credited them with building confidence in the UN that allows it to play a growing role in global affairs.
We hope to have that report shortly. When we do have the report, we will be bringing it to you.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center.
Well, to start with, wow. That was really something. It's been a long wait, 2.5 years, or a little bit better than that, as we've said before. Congratulations for a job well done.
NASA boss James Fletcher celebrating with the Cape Canaveral launch team after Space Shuttle Discovery's roaring, soaring liftoff. The spacecraft shot from the launch pad with a huge billow of white smoke and a blinding flash of orange flame. Utah Senator Jake Garn, who once flew on a shuttle mission, was here to see the U.S. manned space program resume.
Well, I didn't expect to, but I started to cry, and I looked down and I had goosebumps all over. Just an emotional reaction to seeing my friends go back into space and the orbiter that I flew on, Discovery. But just the incredible achievement of we've fixed the problems, we're flying again, we've got a safer vehicle, and we've got access to space and the future that brings to us.
There was a stark reminder of the tragedy 32 months ago when Discovery reached the point where Challenger blew up.
Discovery, go and throttle up. Go.
And go Discovery did, a flawless flight into orbit 184 miles above the Earth. Discovery's already making a second pass around the globe, and right about now, pilot Dick Covey should be opening the big payload bay doors, preparing for the major job of this 4-day mission, the deployment of the TDRS communications satellite. It's nearly identical to the satellite that was lost aboard Challenger. TDRS should be pushed out in about 5 hours. I'm Bill Whitney at the Kennedy Space Center. Now more news with Mike Pulsifer in New York.
Well, Bill, President Reagan reacted to the successful launch by declaring America is back in space, and he said the country now looks forward to the safe return of the crew. Thousands of people flocked to the area around the launch site to watch as Discovery blasted off. They weren't disappointed.
Awesome. I've never seen something like this in my life.
This is incredible. It's a fantastic feeling. It's success.
Looks fantastic. Great launch.
This is gorgeous. It's breathtaking. I don't know. I'm just really excited.
But you can't believe it, that's all.
Oh, it looks like a light in the sky. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Those people watched the launch in Daytona Beach, Florida, about 60 miles north of the Kennedy Space Center. On Wall Street to the hour, the Dow Industrials are up 21 points at 2106.5. New York Stock Exchange volume 88 1/3 million shares. Fire
2 p.m.
CBS News, this is Judy Muller. The nation held its breath today, and then a huge sigh of relief as Americans soared back into space. Christopher Glenn has more from the Kennedy Space Center.
Another flight milestone passed a short while ago when the payload bay doors were successfully cranked open, an absolute must on any shuttle mission to keep temperatures inside down to bearable levels. Here at the Cape, the glow of elation the textbook launch sparked in the NASA team is still very much in evidence. Shuttle Operations Director Tom Utzman.
I've never seen a firing room with as much emotion after launch. It dwarfs STS-1 or any of the others, and I think there was a sense of closeness between the team members that only could be appreciated after the couple years of hard work that led up to this.
No time for elation for the Discovery crew. They're already busy readying a $100 million NASA communication satellite for deployment from the cargo bay about 3 hours from now. Christopher Glenn, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
President Reagan was among the first to congratulate NASA.
America is back in space. We're now looking forward to the successful completion of the Discovery mission and the safe return of her 5-member crew. We salute the bravery of Rick Hawk, Dick Covey, Pinky Nelson, Mike Lounge, and Dave Hilmers, and we ask God to bless this important voyage.
Thousands of people lined the highways at the Cape to watch Discovery soar into the skies.
Unbelievable. It was so great. I mean, I almost feel like crying. I'm so proud to be an American. I've been here all night long. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable. Words can't describe it. I'm so proud. It's great.
But you didn't have to be an American to be impressed.
It's unbelievable. I'm from England, and, well, just to be here is absolutely a miracle. To see that go up was something I've always wanted to see, and I'm glad I did.
The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded today to the United Nations peacekeeping forces. There are now 7 groups of peacekeepers on duty around the world, numbering about 10,000 troops.
CBS News, I'm Dick Reeves. First it was lump in the throat, fingers crossed time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Then it was time to go. After all these months of worry and hope and change, moments to savor.
3, 2, 1...
Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower. NASA's Hugh Harris not only cleared, but flew and arced and orbited. Discovery returning to space. Elation time. And after that...
You can bet that there are some ascent folks that are relieved that we have accomplished our task. On the other hand, the work is just starting, and there's a big, long mission out ahead of us that the people that work the orbit shifts have to do.
Flight Director Gary Cohen ahead this afternoon, about 2 hours from now, deployment of a $100 million tracking and relay satellite. Other experiments ahead, too, in the 4-day mission. The shuttle scheduled to land Monday at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The presidential candidates agreed on the shuttle launch. America is back in space, said George Bush. A very special morning, said Michael Dukakis. Democratic vice presidential candidate Lloyd Benson managed to put a partisan spin on the launch, saying the next president will have to forge a space program consensus.
We'll make sure that America's space program is first rate, that we're going to go for the gold, that we'll work to regain leadership in space, and we'll commit America to a program of exploration and adventure that's second to none.
CBS News, I'm Dick Reeves. The Space Shuttle Discovery has now settled into orbit. It's been nearly 6 hours since the shuttle lifted off safely from Cape Canaveral, much to the delight of NASA and the nation. Jay Scott of CBS radio affiliate WTKN watched the blast off with students at Osceola High School in St. Petersburg.
There it is. There you go.
Many of the students watched the initial liftoff on TV and then rushed outside the school where minutes later the shuttle came into view in the Tampa Bay area. Some of the kids had witnessed the Challenger disaster from the same place over 2.5 years ago and were a bit apprehensive about today's launch.
I think everybody was a little bit scared. I mean, I know as it was going up, my heart was just kind of going. I think it's neat. They did it.
Once the Discovery disappeared from the Florida sky, all of the students agreed they were relieved to see the successful liftoff as the shuttle rocketed out of view and into space. Jay Scott for CBS News, St. Petersburg.
Vice President George Bush on the campaign trail in St. Charles, Missouri, told the crowd following the launch that America is back.
I'd say the spirit of the nation is upbeat. We're filled with pride in our astronauts, pride in the athletes in the Olympics, so proud of how far we've come in the last 8 years.
The head of the commission that investigated the Challenger accident called it a wonderful day for the space program. CBS News, I'm Dick Reeves. A bumper crop of anticipation and elation as the Space Shuttle Discovery successfully fired into orbit from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida this morning. However, the 5-man crew, after celebrating the return of the shuttle program to orbit, got down to business. opening the cargo bay doors. Part of their mission to deploy and send out into an orbit of its own, TDRS, TITRIS, a 2.5-ton, $100 million tracking and data relay satellite, just like the one lost when the Challenger blew up 32 months ago. The Discovery crew got the go from Mission Control.
Discovery, Houston. Go ahead. Discovery, you are go for deploy.
And now TITRIS has been deployed. More experiments are ahead for the shuttle. It is scheduled to complete its 4-day mission Monday when it lands, as so many shuttles have before it, at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Guess what? The Soviets have a shuttle too, and they chose today to show pictures of it. The story from Jan Chorlton in Moscow.
The average Soviet citizen got a glimpse tonight of the Americans' return to the space race. The national television broadcast Vremya showing a short clip of the liftoff, along with a straightforward meat and potatoes report about the launch. But what the Soviets also got to see at the top of the news was a first-time ever look at the Soviet version of the shuttle. Photographs of a ship that looks almost exactly like the American Discovery. The Soviets are extremely proud of their space program and extremely curious about whatever the Americans are doing. As this was the day of the American launch, not to be outdone, the Soviets broadcast an in-space interview with their 3 cosmonauts now circling the globe in a space endurance marathon. Jan Charlton, CBS News, Moscow.
Tomorrow, a suddenly called meeting of the Central Committee in Moscow. Saturday, an urgent session of the Parliament. What's going on? One high Soviet government source predicted a shakeup in the hierarchy, and President Reagan says he would guess this is all about reforms Gorbachev wants, reforms Mr. Reagan hopes he gets.
This is The World Tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News, reporting from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Unbelievable. It was so great. I mean, I almost feel like crying. I'm so proud to be an American. I've been here all night long. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable. Words can't describe it. Anyway, I'm so proud. It's great.
Joy bursting from just one of hundreds of thousands who jammed the Cape Canaveral area today to witness America's return to space. But the joy was preceded by the white-knuckle tension of Shuttle Discovery's blastoff, tinged with apprehension even the 32 months since the awful Challenger explosion couldn't wipe away.
10, we're go for main engine start. 7, 6, start. 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
The moment had been preceded by an hour-and-a-half delay, waiting for unsatisfactory wind conditions aloft to change and fixing some minor glitches that cropped up after the crew had entered the spacecraft. But once the solid rocket boosters at the root of Challenger's disaster had been jettisoned, once the huge external fuel tank was empty and the shuttle was on its own, Launch Director Bob Seek had the last word for those who say it should have happened sooner.
Some even would say that's years behind when you should have been back in space. And so be it, but I guarantee you it was a keeper.
Later still, after a burn of the onboard maneuvering rockets to finalize Discovery's flight path went off without a hitch, even the cool commander of the spaceship, Rick Houck, let his feelings show through.
Yes, nice to be in orbit. And Space Shuttle Discovery is now in orbit. The ohms burn complete. Propulsion system officer reported that the burn looked good.
President Reagan was quick to praise the crew. Houck, Dick Covey, Mike Lounge, David Hilmers, and Pinky Nelson, shuttle veterans all. But it was another spaceman of sorts, one of only 2 practicing politicians who have taken that rocket ride, Utah Senator Jake Garn, who expressed the pride of the moment for all of us.
Well, I didn't expect to, but I started to cry, and I looked down and I had goosebumps all over.
This is The World Tonight. We'll be back with more from the Kennedy Space Center in just a moment.
I'm talking with a Kelly Services customer.
Absolutely.
Are you happy with Kelly?
Of course. Why wouldn't I be?
Well, why would you be? Tell us why.
They are professional. Not only in the temporaries, but in the staff that they have available to assist me.
The Kelly supervisors, you mean?
Yes. They are not as concerned about making a placement, but in answering my individual needs. That, to me, makes the difference.
Boy, that's high praise.
Well, I really do feel that way. In my position, I'm concerned with the bottom line.
Kelly is a good value?
Good value and productive employee, which has to improve bottom line.
What would you say to a company that had never used Kelly?
You use Kelly, and then you won't have to concern yourself with talking with everyone else in town.
What would you say to someone who doesn't work for Kelly, but who might want to become a temporary?
If you're looking for a class operation to work for, Kelly is the place.
Kelly Services, the first and the best.
Kelly does deliver. They really do.
Time is scarce on shuttle missions, and the Discovery astronauts have been busy all day.
Set deploy at Houston.
Roger, Discovery.
They successfully completed the primary task of the mission, deploying a $100 million NASA communication satellite, identical to one destroyed in the Challenger explosion. A few minutes ago, out of communications range, and after moving the shuttle a safe distance away, a small rocket was to be fired to boost the satellite more than 22,000 miles up, joining a network of similar satellites and eventually permitting NASA to close its costly worldwide string of ground communication stations. Soon, a sleep period. Rest at last after a historic, fulfilling day. I'm Christopher Glenn at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Now, more news with Doug Poling in New York.
The Soviets stole some of the thunder from the Discovery launch today. They still don't have a space shuttle, but they chose this day to show the Soviet people what they have in mind. Jan Charlton has that story.
It was the first glimpse ever of the Soviet version of the space shuttle. Tonight's evening news showed photographs of the huge Soviet booster rocket Energia in launch position, and attached to its side an almost perfect duplicate of the American space shuttle Discovery. The Soviets haven't given the craft a name, but a Western expert says it probably has no rear engines, unlike the American shuttle. The Soviet shuttle's first flight will most likely be unmanned for 6 or 7 orbits. The Soviets say they're still checking out the automatic pilot system. The world premiere of the Soviet shuttle was at the top of the broadcast, followed by an interview with orbiting cosmonauts. And it wasn't until about a half an hour later that a short clip of the Discovery's perfect launch was shown. With the Americans solidly back in the space race, the Soviets apparently didn't want to take second billing, at least not on their own airwaves. Jan Charlton, CBS News, Moscow.
The World Tonight, more in a moment.
CBS News, I'm David Jackson. A day well done for the 5 Discovery astronauts. They've been given the go-to-bed signal and are trying for some weightless sleep right now. The day was pretty much picture perfect, from launch to deployment of a NASA communication satellite. One problem with the heat exchanger has the crew sweating a bit, but according to Flight Director Chuck Shaw in Houston, not much.
The cabin's a little warm. We had the crew change the water interchanger configuration to bring the temperature down. When I left the control center, the cabin temperature was in mid to lower 80s, which these guys all live in Houston, so they're used to that temperature. That's kind of a cool day here in Houston.
The United States and 11 friends today signed a deal to build a space station, one to be operational by the mid-1990s. The U.S. is to pay $16 billion for it, the Allies $10. But nobody...
Back in the space shuttle and satellite delivery business, even if they were placing the $100 million tracking and data relay satellite into geosynchronous orbit for themselves. But although NASA officials say the main objective of this 4-day mission is the deployment of the satellites, the real goal was and is to get the Discovery launched and returned to Earth safely. After this morning's picture-perfect launch, NASA's Chief Administrator James Fletcher praised the work of the entire NASA family.
All I can say is that the nation owes you a lot, and will continue to owe you a lot in the months and years to come. This is the first of a new era, as we've said before. Congratulations for a job well done.
The historic mission is scheduled to conclude Monday morning with the landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. At the Johnson Space Center, Steve McVicker, KTRH News Radio 740 AM.
Students at a Clear Lake area school with a special connection to the Discovery watch space history being made. News Radio's Steve Boss says the kids are classmates of a Discovery astronaut's child.
grade classmates of Danny Hilmers, son of Discovery crewman Dave Hilmers, launched a celebration of their own as they watched the shuttle's ascent. For many of the youngsters at McWhorter Elementary, like Bobby Bowman, it will be a lasting memory.
Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to see a shuttle launch, and when I was in school, it was a replay, and I never actually saw the Challenger 2 years ago. So this has been real exciting for me.
If this launch is any indication, the 2.5-year lull in shuttle flights did little to quell American youth's fascination with the space program. Steve Boss, KTRH, News Radio 740 AM.
And even more of America's school children take delight in watching the shuttle blast off. 11-year-old Jody Fowler, a 6th grader at Tulsa's Krista McAuliffe Elementary School, describes what the launch meant to her and her classmates.
It's special because our school is named after Krista McAuliffe, and she is one of the astronauts on the Challenger, and this is like a new beginning to make up for the Challenger, and she was part of that, and this is all kind of in her memory.
Other children haunted by the Challenger explosion admitted being a little scared during the launch, but relieved when the shuttle reached into the sky. To add to the joy of America's return to space, Secretary of State George Shultz announces that 11 other nations have joined with the U.S. in its bid to build and man a space station.
It is not for nothing that we, the world's foremost democracies, have chosen to call our project Space Station Freedom. For the democratic ideals that we share will carry us boldly into the future, even as they carried generations before us from the age of reason through the industrial era and into the space age.
Estimated cost of the space station will be about $23 billion, with the U.S. paying $16 billion and maintaining a controlling interest. KTRH News Time, 1036. It's News Time, 12 o'clock. This is the news station, KTRH, News Radio 740 AM. Good morning. I'm Jack Stevenson. In the news, high hopes were replaced by higher spirits as America staged what for all appearances was a smooth return to space. The liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery from the Kennedy Space Center earned praise from President Reagan, members of Congress, space professionals, and citizens across the nation. The crew loosed its primary payload, a communication satellite identical to one destroyed when the Challenger blew up 32 months ago. The crew of 5 are asleep now. Before saying goodnight, both astronauts and ground controllers in Houston commented on how the first day of the flight was, quote, a fun day.